Hello, and welcome to another season of the Storied Arcs podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike.
And I'm your co-host, Alex.
And now we are getting ready to do our creator spotlight. This is a massive undertaking that we're going to try to minimize our task for. But our new season will be 4 books by Jeph Loeb and Sale. But of course, each of those books also has other creators, letterers, colorists, like editors. I mean, like the first book has 4 editors, and it's like, well, we don't have time to cover 32 people tonight. So what we'll do is we're going to talk about the team, Loeb Sale.
Yeah. And
then those things will come up in each book as we discuss it. And the colors, I don't mean to minimize the work of colors, but like Sale's art looks like Sale's art. Almost, no matter who's coloring it.
His line work is so distinctive. He's one of the he's one of the actually unique artists out there, where you see his work and it can't be anybody else. He's not trying to replicate anybody else, and people who try to replicate him actually are few and far between, because I think people look at that and be like, well, I can't do that, so they don't even bother. He's one of those. He is one of those artists. This obviously is a change from what our stated mandate is with the show, looking at creator-owned independent comics. But I do contend, and I will contend on these episodes, that the work of Loeb and Sale, specifically the books that we are highlighting and some of the associated books with them that we're not specifically covering here, they are the most indie comic books you can get at the big 2 publishers, where we're doing 2 books from DC, 2 books from Marvel. They have that kind of sensibility, and especially when you consider the time frame in which they were being published. It is much more common now to see books like these, and we'll get to what we mean by books like these a little bit later. But it's much more common now from both Marvel and DC to put out kind of specialized miniseries, maxi series like these with big name characters. It was a little less so at the time, and especially when when the books we're talking about first started coming out, in the mid 90s, mid late 90s, I guess, and then creeping towards kind of the early aughts, when the last books that we're going to talk about were published. It still wasn't a thing that they did, and especially handing over characters to an artist like Sale, who is so distinctive, who has a unique art style that was not the house style at either Marvel or DC at the time. So while these are books from the big 2 publishers, again, I think they have an indie comic sensibility to them.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair to say. Well, before we get too far in any direction, I want to first talk about why we chose this to be like our first massive deviation from. I like that you called it a deviation from the Prime Directive. I think when you and I were scheming.
Yeah.
Because that's a Star Trek term, and in Star Trek, the first thing out the window is always the Prime Directive.
Yes.
So it seems fitting that we would call it the Prime Directive, and then it's like, great, now we know what it is. Throw it out.
Now we can break it.
But so I'm curious how you came to this, because I think this would have been while you were reading comics before you stopped and then got back into it. Like,
no, actually,
this was not in your first stint.
So we should mention which 4 books. So Loeb and Sale are prolific. They got like they're
in the cover art
10,
of this episode, probably,
15 some odd. That is true, but there's a chunk of time there where they worked almost exclusively together. But the 4 books that we have chosen for our deep dives here, in chronological order, in terms of how they were released and how we're going to talk about them, starting with Batman: The Long Halloween, from 96 to 97. Then we're going to Superman for All Seasons, which was in 1998. Then we're jumping across the street over to Marvel to do Daredevil Yellow, which was 01 to 02. And then Spider-Man Blue, which came out in 02 to 03. You want to talk about how we came to these books. These books were coming out at a time when I had basically stopped reading comics. I wasn't reading them at that point. Mid-late 90s, hadn't really read these, hadn't read any of the earlier stuff that that Loeb and Sale had done, because Long Halloween wasn't their first collaboration. It's probably maybe their best well known. We can argue about that later, but it wasn't their first. So they've been working as early as literally the early 90s, 91, 92, something like that. But no, I came to these in the early aughts, actually just about, after all four of these had been finished and collected. I'm looking, looks like Spider-Man Blue, the final issue came out March 03. I graduated from college in 03. And in 03 and 04 was when, after I'd gotten back into comics, starting in like 0102 while I was still in college, reading little things here and there, reading a lot of Vertigo books. That's when I read Sandman, and really wasn't jumping back into any of the Marvel DC stuff. Wasn't until about 03, 04, have a job, have my own place, actually have some money to buy stuff. Probably we're looking at like 04, early 04 at this point, where, I was living in Richmond, Virginia. There's a comic shop a little way down the street from my apartment, and was going in there and was just buying trades.
Well, you got to shout out the comic shop, assuming they're still in business.
They aren't, and I don't remember. And the woman who ran the shop, who was incredibly helpful, I do not remember her name. I'm so sorry. I tried looking it up and I couldn't remember. There are other shops, like there's some new shops that definitely weren't there when I was living there. It's been a while, but I went into this shop and I wasn't back reading single issues at this point. I wasn't picking up floppies. It was all about trades, and it was like, well, time to go read some trades of stuff that I never had read before. Like I had never read like Batman Year One. I never read Kingdom Come or Marvels or Christ on Infinite Earths. I never read any of this stuff, so I picked those up in trade because I didn't have space for single issues, so I had bookshelves. So trades look good on a bookshelf, and I wanted to buy some superhero stuff, but stuff that was self-contained. Kind of the stuff that we talk about here. And so I don't know how I came across Loeb and the Long Halloween, but that was the first one that I ended up buying.
Surely some good soul in the store was like, dude, you gotta check this out.
It was either I picked it up, flipped through it, was like, wow, this art is crazy, and then talking to the owner of the shop, and she said buy it, or either she asked me about what I was looking for, and I said, what are some Batman stories to read, and she pointed me to that. Because I around the same time, and we'll talk about the things that Loeb and Sale have done. At the time that I was there, she asked if I was interested. At some point, I talked to her about Batman. I was like, yeah, I'm interested. I want to read some stories. Haven't read in a while. And because she asked if I was reading Batman currently, and I was like, the monthly issues, I was like, no, I wasn't. And she was like, well, it's kind of really killer right now. You got to get into it. Because at that point, Hush had just wrapped up. And Hush, of course, is Jim Lee and Jeph Loeb doing that run that came out a single issue from like 02 to 03 or something like that. So it was just after that, and
like early 600s, right?
Yeah, 608 to 618, I believe is what it was. But that stuff,
of course,
it just
you know that off the top of your head.
I now I'm dreading what I didn't remember in order to have that locked away. But those trades had also come out. At least Hush was originally released in two trades, a volume 1 and a volume 2, and I those are out of print now. I don't have them anymore. I think I gave them to somebody because I bought like the 15th anniversary one, the full trade now. But initially, I bought them as the first couple of trades, and that was in like the kind of in the whole package of things I was buying. I think I bought Hush, I bought Long Halloween, I bought some other stuff, and read Long Halloween, was like, this is amazing. Like this is incredible. I was so blown away by that. And, so going back, it was kind of like, what else do you have at this point, I was like, what else do you have by Tim Sale? Because I was like, this guy's art is blowing my mind. I need to see more. And then, the prior to the shot mentioned that, hey, there's a sequel, Dark Victory, and there's a quasi prequel, Haunted Night. And then here are these other books they did, if you read Spider-Man or Daredevil, things like that. And I eventually kind of started making my way through the next couple of years. And then that kind of kicked into overdrive in 05, 06, something like that. When Heroes debuted on NBC.
Oh, sure.
For those who don't remember Heroes was a show about people who developed superpowers. It was developed by Tim Kring, who's a longtime showrunner, and Loeb was a exec producer and head writer on it. Because at that point in the early mid-aughts there, he had 15 years of comic book writing under his belt, and part of that show was kind of a meta commentary on comics and superheroes and things like that. And Tim Sale actually did paintings for that show. There was a character who could paint the future. He did heroin and then could paint the future.
Sure.
All the paintings in the show were done by Tim Sale. So and that obviously came from their connection working together all those years. So yeah, for me, it's been, as we're recording this now, about 20 years that I've been reading Loeb and Sale, and Sale has done, he had done less and less interior work through the later part of his career, and unfortunately the later part of his life. Tim Sale passed away, back in 2022, I believe from cancer. Just terribly, terribly sad. But he had done less and less interior work, but still was doing a bunch of covers, main covers, variant covers. And he was someone whose artwork that when I saw it, it was like, if he's doing a cover, that's one I'm going to consider buying,
Yeah. Oh,
and,
well, so yeah, like you say that, and I meant to ask you tonight if you knew why or how it came to be that, like, for Tom King's Batman run, I like the first several story arcs.
The first
Tim
like
Sale
20 some
was
odd
the
issues.
variant artist for everything.
He was, yeah.
And I remember, like, my buddy Drew, his pull list was this was back when analog pull lists were, still written on paper, but his pull list was Batman Sale variant, and if there isn't a Sale variant for that particular month, then whatever. It was just like, it's Tim Sale or bust was basically it. And there were no, as I think back, that like there were no bad covers in that series, so it was like a pretty safe bet. But yeah, the Tim Sale ones, were just incredible.
I think he did them for the first year. Batman Double Ship, that was Rebirth era. They double ship, so it was two issues a month. So I think he did the first 24 some odd, I think. So about the first year.
It was a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm it was simply because he's a legendary Batman artist. And I don't know
I
if
didn't
he
know
was
if
still,
like Tom King handpicked that or if that's a DC.
It could have been. I mean, I don't know at that point. I mean,
I don't think Tom King had that kind of weight.
He didn't have that pull. He had enough notoriety to be given
writer,
Batman.
Yeah.
But I don't know how that. I don't know how variant covers, at least for for independent books, for creator-owned books, oftentimes it's with whatever publisher you're with. The editor may know somebody, make a call. I know some creators will reach out and ask them, ask certain artists if they'll do it, if they can do it. And obviously, if we're talking about like well-known creators, people who've been in the business often, they're all friends, they're all chums. And so that's how people will get, you'll get a variant cover from somebody because they've known the person who's doing the book for the past 25 years, something like that. So I don't know. And it could have been also that he may have still been under contract. And it just did to, I'll provide covers. But he said that was the kind of the latter part of his career. He wasn't doing as much interior work, and same with Loeb as well. Loeb had moved, there was a chunk there about maybe 15 some odd years where he was working in comics, mostly with Tim Sale. And then he kind of moved out of it. He started his career in film, worked in comics, and then he kind of moved into television. And that's kind of what he's been doing. I think, they've, little things here and there, but nothing like the body of work that he produced from, like 91 to, 06 or something like that, 05 maybe, that like 15 some odd years, highly concentrated, just put out a ton of work. And again, the vast majority of it was with Tim Sale.
Yeah. I mean, the cool thing, just as a shout out to any like people who love sorting through comic bins, like those Sale variants for the Batman Rebirth series were not like, I find them in clearance bins all the time. And it's just like, it is mind boggling to me because like so much of the cover game now is about like, do a cover about, some crossover event, or it's like the 60th anniversary of some character and some, and his were like tied to the story. And it was a story King was telling with new characters, and seeing like Gotham and Gotham Girl on those covers depicted in Tim Sale art immediately made it feel like long established canon.
That's a great point too. It wasn't just, I mean, I'm sure maybe some of them were like random Batman and Bat Family drawings he had done, but you're right, especially early on. They were, necessarily tied to what was happening in the book, but you're right, they did feature some of the characters that may have been in that issue, which is generally a step beyond a lot of what you see in some of the variant cover game now. It is just, hey, we got this artist, either to draw a cover for it, or here's something an artist has done that we are now using as a cover. It's one of those directions. But yeah, it's I think there are some people that don't like his art, and I understand why they don't. I think they're crazy, but there are, it is non-traditional style for these heroes that have been around for so long, these characters that people have an idea of what they look like. But I think for someone like me who had been out of the game, who read as a child, then wasn't reading any of these characters at all for a long time, and came back to it as effectively an adult and was seeing his version of these characters, like his Batman is ingrained in my mind. Like I think of his Batman when I think of a drawn Batman, which is you don't see that Batman anywhere else except if Tim Sale draws it. It's not the Batman that anybody else draws. His style for it is it stands out so much, but is the one that resonates for me, because when I was getting back into comics, when I was getting back into it on my own account, on my own dime, not more on my own dollar, I guess. Not we're not talking about dimes anymore. When I was buying on my own, and not just reading stuff that my brother had brought home, his artwork was some of the first stuff where I looked at and said, "Oh, this is more than just the words. It's more than just the character. There's someone with a style here, and I like this style. It speaks to me."
Yeah, someone with a massively unwieldy large cape.
Yes,
like
the high pointy ears too,
yeah.
Which is a callback to 1927 original Batman kind of design, not just kind of the small stuff that kind of pervade through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even the aughts, and even you see it now. We're talking long, kind of spindly.
Yeah, when they were like embarrassed about the silliness of it's a man dressed like a bat. And Tim Sale was like, nope, it is what it is.
Well, and there's no silliness in his art. It's silly when you think about it. Yeah, why is he has a Spawn-esque like cape that appears to be, if you laid it end to end, it may be like 35 feet long and like 55 feet wide. Yeah. It's a huge tent. And not we'll talk about the way he designed some of his characters going forward there, but there's nothing silly about the art, even though yes, it is often in times wildly exaggerated. But again, for me, that was a huge selling point when I looked at that and thought, oh, this is different. This is not what I remember. And I connected with this so fully. And again, because it wasn't the house style at either Marvel and DC, and it is more the kind of thing you see now when a creator owns a book and artist and writer get together, that artist is doing whatever the hell they want. They're making their characters up. They're drawing it their way. They're drawing it in their style. They don't have to conform to what a house style might look like. And I use that term house style, knowing that both Marvel and DC have very much in a lot of ways moved past that now, because there's so many varied artists around the world that are available. So they're less concerned about that. You can pick up books that have a wide range of art styles. But back in the 90s, that was not the case. Everything kind of looked the same. It looked like what the guys who left to form Image, like, everything looked the same. It was all quasi reminiscent of like, a Kurt Swan or a Neil Adams kind of thing, which in turn was quasi reminiscent of the guys who came before, like Ramita and Kirby and Ditko and things like that. There was all iterative, and here we had something that was like wildly brand new. Yeah. So, Mike, what is your origin story for Loeb and Sale? I'm assuming it's Long Halloween, right?
It is. Yeah, no, it's Long Halloween, but there's a particular reason why it's Long Halloween, and it was before I ever darkened the door of a comic store. And I would say, starting with trades and you buying from places like Barnes and Noble leads to mass confusion about the distinction between a trade paperback and a graphic novel. But we'll get into that later, because I think for 10 years I referred to Batman Long Halloween as a graphic novel. It isn't.
Technically, it isn't. Yes. Yes, but
right. I have no problem. Like, I'm not going to correct someone if they say that. Yeah. I just don't want to be corrected on the podcast.
Yeah.
So anyway, I absolutely fell in love with Chris Nolan's Batman Begins in '05,
Ah,
and
yes.
Dark Knight I saw. I was I was debating with my friend the other. It was either 7 or 8 times in the theater that summer. I mean, it was like every time someone was like, "Oh my gosh, have you seen Dark Knight yet?" I'm like, "Yeah, it was incredible." They're like, "Oh, I was gonna ask if you want to go see it tonight." I'm like, "Still ask." I'm like, "I'm right here. I
I'm
will go
in.
see
I'm in.
it."
That was
So
'08 too for Dark Knight, right? Because
it
that
was
was
oh, it was
oh '08
'08.
was because that
That
was
and
Dark
Iron
Knight
Man
and
and
Iron
Hulk
Man.
and
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Or
Um,
Eaton.
so I got the like deluxe DVD. The
Mhm.
it came out. I had it pre-ordered. Immediately watched the movie and then watched all the special content and commentary. And one of the things was Chris Nolan talking about his influences for the
That's
series.
right.
And he listed 3 books, which was Batman Long Halloween, Batman Year One by Frank Miller, and Dark Knight, uh, the first one,
Dark Knight
Returns.
Returns.
I
Yeah,
was going to
yeah,
say Strikes
yeah.
Again. I was like, it definitely wasn't that one.
Definitely
Uh,
not that one.
it's definitely
Uh,
not that one.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
That's
so
right.
anyway,
That was on the special features.
right, and that was my reading list. And the first one I grabbed was, and my buddy Drew, who I'm hoping will maybe join us for the long Halloween discussion or part of it or something. But um, I was like, you know, have you heard of these? Are these like boutique books? It was like, no, these are huge titles.
Yeah,
Like
you can
this
get
is
these anywhere.
these are rites of passage titles, and I was like, cool, cool, cool. So I started with Long Halloween, um, having never read like a comic book before, or at least like a superhero comic or something aimed at for adults.
Mhm.
Uh, it was a very easy entry point. Like if you know Batman from the movies, you can pick up Loeb Sale, Long Halloween, and like follow. But you'll feel
Well,
like
yeah.
you're getting like deep backstory on stuff. And like I loved like I think when I watched like the '05 Batman Begins and there's like however you want to pronounce it, Falcone and Maroni or Falcone and Maroni. I
Yeah.
think Nolan went with Falcone and Maroni,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
newest Batman went with Falcone, which I think is more
Fal
correct, probably.
I probably I don't know. Yeah,
Um,
I think you're right. Falcone.
but either way, it was like, you know, if you're just watching the movie, they weren't super important characters, and that's almost a throwaway line. But then you pick this up, and they really focus on like the crime lord, grip on Gotham,
Yeah.
and you hear a lot about the Maroni family
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
Falcone family, and you get all this important backstory, and it was just like candy. And it was, and then being able to reverse engineer, like Nolan said, like he very specifically had pictures in his mind of like the three, Dark Knight, White Knight, and Gordon meeting on
Yeah.
rooftops.
Sure.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's just ripped directly from the pages of Long
Absolutely.
Halloween.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
There
Yeah.
are also scenes from, Batman Year One that are just straight out of, on the screen from the book as well. Dark Knight Returns, I don't get that comp at all,
It's
other
because
than it's
everyone
like
says Dark.
dark.
Because
Yeah,
everyone says Dark Knight Returns. I have my thoughts on Dark Knight Returns, and I know when it comes to the comic community, I'm generally in the minority on that.
right. And it's just like,
And,
and you're
and,
not trying
and
to take it
overall,
away
my
from
thoughts on
anyone, so
like
just
Frank Miller and all
leave
that.
it
But
alone.
yeah, but he
Um,
casts a long shadow here because you know, year one. Also, we're going to talk about a Daredevil book. We talk about great Daredevil runs. It's really Daredevil Yellow and Born Again, which was Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. So I mean, like
right.
he casts a shadow here.
But
But yeah,
in
actually,
both cases, these are authors who are like bringing a fresh perspective to a character, and
oh
whether
yeah,
you
yeah.
like the perspective or not isn't really important. The fact is
Oh
they
well,
changed
yeah.
the character in a way that no one can write them the same way, exactly the same way again.
And I agree. I think the one difference, maybe we'll talk about this as we get through the various talk about it more as we get through the various issues, the various discussions, is that what he did with Batman and Dark Knight Returns was a future version of Batman, like an Elseworlds version of Batman. What he did to Daredevil was in quote unquote continuity, and we're talking about that word a lot, but that was in the main line of continuity. So everything we know about Daredevil now, like the tortured Catholic, all this guilt and
Right.
help and weight on him, that's all the stuff that Miller put in, and that obviously informs specifically when we get to Daredevil Yellow with what Loeb and Sale did, because that influenced what Daredevil was into the 90s, and then definitely into the Marvel Knights era, which that was Kevin Smith, Joe Quesada, David Mack, Jimmy Palmiotti, like that era right there at the late 90s, early aughts, which was right before Daredevil. All of that comes from Miller. That's redefining the character in terms of as we know it now. Dark Knight Returns is try to remind people, like, that's not actually Batman. Like that's a version of Batman that doesn't exist. That just comes from Frank Miller's mind. And it's an important work. It's a seminal
Sure,
work.
but like, but year one, so
Well, yeah,
like,
yeah. But
I think the interesting thing is that year one was designed to be like, I mean, in many ways, it was designed to be like an entry point. It's an on ramp. Like a lot of people give out year one as someone's first Batman book. I give out Long Halloween.
Well, Batman was because most people don't need the origin of Batman. People know everyone knows.
No, but
Crime
it is
Alley.
still cool to see him start with like nuts and bolts, and
it is. And that book's important, obviously. That's resetting the origin post Christ on Infinite Earths. Like that's a major moment across all of kind of DC Comics. But if someone is just, and I think the vast majority, I don't want to say, that's tough to say. I don't want to say that. Anyone who'd be interested in reading a Batman story knows the origin of Batman. And so I agree with you. Giving him something like Long Halloween is like, hey, here's just a really cool mystery book. Here's a really cool self-contained, early days of Batman. I think that's the important thing in terms of where it falls in the Batman timeline, in the Batman quote unquote continuity. It's a year one, year two story. That's where Loeb and Sale set their Batman stuff. So I mentioned I started with that as well, and then just for me tore through everything that Tim Sale was doing and realizing it has happened to also be the stuff that Jeph Loeb was writing. So how did you move from
Long you're Halloween smarter than I am, because I read Long Halloween and I thought I loved Batman. And which I do. I love Batman. Well, I still read plenty of Batman. Yeah. But what I loved was Loeb's Sale. Yeah. And it took me a long time of like, going to the library, getting stuff, reading different this I started getting into it in grad school, which is not a time to do single issues or any spending out of discretionary funds. So but I lived right next door to the library. They had a ton of trades and stuff like that.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Then my next one would have been Daredevil Yellow, which
and this is late aughts now. This is post.
No, this would be
early 2010s.
Yeah, so I mean, I think when that Dark Knight DVD came out, that would have been like 2009.
Probably, yeah.
And I wasn't hooked on comics. I just thought like, cool. Yeah. I read the Batman stuff that came with that. Dark Knight Rises came out. He didn't reveal any more influences.
Yeah. We'll get to that though. We'll get to that in the discussion of Long Halloween. Just you wait. Right. That's called a tease.
But then I think I started getting interested in that Daredevil character when Netflix Marvel stuff was happening. Yes. And then I was looking for an on-ramp with Daredevil, and it was like, oh, Loeb Sale. They're a good on-ramp. Which is like not at all a warranted guess after having read one book. But sample size of 1, n equals 1. It worked out great. So then it was like, now it's a sample size of 2.
Yeah.
And then by the time I got to Spider-Man Blue, which was pretty recently, it's like, I'm not a big Spider-Man reader. I don't think I would have I know the story because of like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man 3.
Yeah.
Or no, from Amazing Spider-Man 2.
Oh, that's right. Yeah,
the Gwen dies.
Right. Yeah.
And then, you go home and you Google it and you're like, that was a weird choice. And then all the comic people swarm on you and they're like, that's what happened in the comics. It's like so accurate. It's so true. It's like, okay, but she was there for like, I don't know, 40 minutes of screen time or something. It seems like,
I mean, it's only like one of the 10 most important comic storylines in history, moments in history.
I thought you were going to say deaths in comic history.
No, like just deaths, absolutely. But like moments, and I got Amazing Spider-Man may have like 5 of those if I say top 10 all time. But yeah, I mean, so you say you're not really a Spider-Man reader. I'm not a Daredevil reader. I've read like the quote unquote important Daredevil stuff, and a lot of people I know love Daredevil. It was never something I read, but like I love Daredevil Yellow because I love the story. I love the way it's told. I love everything about it, even though I personally have no connection to the character.
Yeah. I mean, you still have not read Zdarsky's, right?
No. I mean,
That's
I've read Born Again. I've read some of the '80s stuff. I've read some of the Nascenti stuff, Nascenti,
oh yeah,
John
yeah,
Romita
yeah.
stuff in the early '90s. I've read the early, again, Marvel Knight stuff that was written by initially by
Yeah.
Kevin Smith
It
and all
seems
that
like
stuff.
you sure gave it
I,
a chance.
I
Because that's like Brian Michael Bendis in the in Marvel Knights era, right?
eventually Bendis comes in after that. Bendis did and Mac. I've dipped in it, but this is all retroactively. I didn't read at the time. This is all like
Okay.
I'm going to go back and read this because I know people have had it, and I want to get a better understanding of the character. But I mean, the current stuff, Zdarsky and Marco Cacchetto had a great long run. And then there was what I think Saladin Ahmed and Aaron Cooter. It's like they're it, and like Brubaker's had a like it's a character that like people kind of check off and say that they've done. You know, everyone's got a
Right.
Batman story, everyone's got a Spider-Man story, a Superman story. Daredevil is one of those characters, and it comes down to there aren't that many writers that can say they've written the ongoing Batman and Daredevil runs. You know, it's Brubaker has done that. Zdarsky's done that. Again, Kevin Smith has done that, and he's written Batman in miniseries. So like it's not something that people that a ton of people have, but he's one of those characters that is beloved, and it just I don't know, it never hit for me. It wasn't one I didn't read growing up, which meant my brother didn't collect it, so I didn't read it growing up. That's
Right.
what it came down to. Tony, that's your fault. But I've gone
Wasn't
back.
part of the GI Joe universe.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he wasn't an X-Men. That's why he wasn't a mutant. That's what it came down to, really.
Oh yeah.
If you weren't in the X office, like those comics weren't laying around my house growing up. If X book mutants, something like that, we're in. But I've dipped back in, and I know enough of the story just because I've dipped my toe in just to basically so I can be proficient in it, just in like conversationally about it. But again, Daredevil Yellow, I think, is phenomenal. I think it's really, really good. I think, we'll talk about all the books that Loeb and Sale did together. I mean, Yellow and Blue are I think kind of leaps and bounds above the other ones that they did in the Marvel Colors series, which we'll get to. But
Yeah, which is interesting because I've taken your word for it.
Yeah.
But there are fans of those
Oh no!
series. I mean,
absolutely. Oh no! I think it comes down
like
to
they're not flops.
it
They're
comes
just
down to your
hits.
relationship to the character.
Right.
But I think Daredevil is one that there's something about it that really hits for someone who may not even be into Daredevil. And I think for me, it comes down to I love the work of these two guys together. I'm going to read it. I'm going to find something in it that I like. It's usually going to be the way that Loeb writes his stories and presents his stories, and and Sale's artwork. Like those are two things that I love that I know a number of comic fans don't like, just in terms of what their styles are in terms of how they like actually tell story, like panel layout, how they do dialogue and or narration, things like that. These are elements that I know there are comic readers that just don't like because they're not used to it. But maybe just in terms of, again, what I read when I was coming back in, or just what my sensibilities are. I love the way that these guys presented stories together. So I would go and go out of my way to try to read everything that they've done together, which I haven't quite done, but I've read. Looking through it, I've read probably everything on their list together except for
Well,
like
why don't you
two
just give
early
us the
books.
list right now? I mean,
You want to do it right now?
yeah,
You want
we
to do it
kind
right
of
now,
covered our origin. Let's do the let's
okay,
run
all
through
right,
the gambit, not beat around the bush. And
all
then
right.
once we've covered the whole list, we'll say,
We'll talk about Loeb and Sale
here's
outside of what they did. Yeah.
well that
Well,
and like
actually,
here's
hold
why
on.
we picked the four we picked.
Well,
Two Marvel, two
real,
DC.
actually, but before we do that, let's cover Loeb and Sale real quick about their histories as best we can, as quickly as we can. Obviously, these guys have been around a long time. We're not going to name every book they've ever done.
My God.
That would be here forever. But I mentioned real quickly that Jeph Loeb's career is, you can really kind of break it down, his professional career, breaking down to about three segments. He started working in film as a screenwriter, then got brought into comics, and then got moved over into television. That's kind of where he's been. It's very important. We have to talk about his early film career because he co-wrote Teen Wolf. Okay. And after that, he co-wrote the story for Commando. He didn't write that script. That script got the shooting script that Schwarzenegger had was someone else, but he co-wrote that idea. But he's a co-creator of Teen Wolf. Like,
That's high praise. And I have
that's
seen
incredible.
that. I haven't
Yeah.
seen Goonies, but I have seen Teen Wolf.
Okay. Well, we the Goonies thing. We still need to talk about that. But what? So this is in the '80s. Here he's working as a. I think he majored in film. Went to film school. This is where he's working. But in the late '80s, he was working on a Flash movie. For Warner Brothers DC that I think he wrote. I think he wrote some script treatments on. It never went anywhere. But what that did was that put him in touch with people at DC. And Jeanette Kahn, who was the publisher at DC at the time, she's the one responsible for bringing him into comics to try writing at that point. And so, I, I think his first work, I think, was this Challenges of the Unknown book in 1991, which was with Tim Sale. Um,
Okay.
and so it starts right there, and then we'll go through some of his those specific books. But I already mentioned, after this long, basically like a 10-year chunk where he's only working with Tim Sale, he's done things like I mentioned Hush with Jim Lee. That was in the main Batman line, which was monumentally huge. In like around that same time, '03 to '05, '06, something like that, he brought back or started the Superman Batman comic, team up comic. What's interesting now is when they do those books now they're always Batman, Superman. But the one that Loeb started was Superman, Batman. He did that mainly with Ed McGuinness, which was, there some other, Michael Turner had an arc there, Cos Pacheco, but it's mainly Loeb and McGuinness. Almost all of those stories, the initial like 3-4 arcs, I think have all been used for DC animated movies like Public Enemies, Supergirl, things like that. So
Heck, even Challenges the Unknown was picked up for the Teen Titans Go movie.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
these are stories that Superman Batman run, the first 20 some odd issues I think that Loeb wrote. I think those are incredible. I think it's the first 4 trades, maybe like 2 deluxe volumes. They're great. They're great stories. Coming out of that was Supergirl. So they brought back Supergirl, kind of Supergirl, the Supergirl we have now, that exists now and has gone through, New 52 and Rebirth and things like that. That started coming out of this the Superman Batman series, because people don't know, spoilers alert for Crisis on Infinite Earth, Supergirl died in 1986 with Crisis on Infinite Earth, and she'd come back in some forms early on, but this was like her
Grand
reintroduction.
reentry, yeah.
Yeah, her reintroduction proper, and it's the one that I believe her origin story now exists. It dates back to this comic, and she was doing that with he was doing that with Ian Churchill, through the mid aughts there. Also in the '90s, at some point he did sign exclusives with DC and Marvel, but he was bouncing back and forth. He worked in the X office for about 4 or 5 years. Sorry, about 3 or 4 years in the mid '90s. During the Age of Apocalypse era, he's a credited co-creator of X-Men, Nate Gray, which is the Age of Apocalypse version of Cable, Nathan Summers. He co-created that with Noah Geary. Let's see here. One of his last things that he did was a Captain America story in 2007. Is that what the notes say? 2007. Yeah, it was a Captain America Fallen Soldier. This is after the events of Civil War, the first Civil War, where, spoiler alert, Captain America is assassinated. He gets better, but at the time he was dead. And what they did in this book here, this is Loeb. This was a 5-issue miniseries, and each issue was drawn by a different artist, and they showed the reaction of Marvel heroes. It showed their reaction to the death of Captain America, and each issue was framed around one of the 5 stages of grief, which is this idea of framing a miniseries, a story around some kind of external framework, something that we'll talk about obviously in the books that we're doing for our discussion. But this is kind of another way that he did it, in another, kind of continuing that kind of lattice work for how to create and how to put together a miniseries. So that's Captain America Fallen Son. I guess the last one I have here is he co-created the Sam Alexander Nova, which is Teen Nova with Ed McGuinness. Again, came over from Superman, Batman. He's the kid version of Nova. He's on the Champions with Kamala Khan and Miles Morales. They were Avengers for a while too. Also had runs on like Hulk, FF. He did work in the Ultimate Universe. He did work on Heroes Reborn and all that. So he's got almost, I think maybe just shy about 20 years of work in comics at Marvel and at DC. But again, so much of that is with Tim Sale. Outside of Jeph Loeb, Tim Sale doesn't have a whole lot of work either. He does have a really, really great Superman story. It was in Superman Confidential, which I guess is now called Superman Kryptonite. I think it's issues 1 through 6. He did that with Darwin Cook. Darwin Cook was writing, Tim Sale was drawing. It's phenomenal. Great Superman story. It's basically it's Superman's first encounter with kryptonite. So it's him
Okay.
discovering it's a story of him discovering that he has a weakness. It's absolutely incredible. Again, Tim Sale, Darwin Cook, two of legitimately my all-time favorite creators in the history of the medium. So, for me, definitely a can't miss. I should mention Death Blow, which is a Wildstorm Image book that he did with Jim Lee and Brandon Che. Again, this is in the Wildstorm universe. If you listen to when Mike and I talked about Ex Machina, and kind of the convoluted history of Wildstorm DC Image and things like that. But he came out of that series in like the third or fourth issue, something like that, and was drawing that in the early mid 90s. And we also mentioned a ton of covers, tons of variants, tons of main covers as well. But in terms of interior work, pretty sparse outside of stuff that's written by Loeb and Sale.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So do you want to cover those now?
yeah, I mean, it's just talking about our origins with Long Halloween. I feel like we almost dove too far in. So
We almost
gotta
did. We almost
we
did.
gotta
So
rein it back in.
yeah, we're not going to talk about the book specifically, but here, I mean, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I got 12. I got 12 books written here, 12 collections, from 91 to technically 2015, but really to 2008. But we'll talk about why that is at the end. But so we'll call it, just about almost 20 years of work. And really those are mostly from 91 to like to oh 05, I guess, is really that concentrated period. It's about 15 years. You got 12 series. So I mentioned Charles the Unknown, 1991's first book they worked on. The next thing that they did were 3 Legends of the Dark Knight Halloween specials. Came out, I think, in consecutive years, 94, 95, 96. That is now collected as Batman Haunted Night. Did you read Haunted Night before?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
was
that's like a de facto spiritual prequel.
so I didn't know the
to
sequence of it when I read it,
Well, of course, yeah, yeah.
but it didn't really matter.
No, because those are standalone stories. I read them. I read those after too. I read after Dark Victory, actually. But yeah, they technically came before Long Halloween. But yeah, there were three specials. Again, now collected as Haunted Night. Their next work, 1995, Wolverine and Gambit. So again, jumping over the cross street, going to Marvel. Then we get to Long Halloween. Mentioned that 96 to 97. They follow that right up with what our second book will be, Superman for All Seasons in 98. They follow that up, 99 to 2000, Batman Dark Victory, which is a direct sequel to Long Halloween. Another fantastic book, one we maybe could have talked about here, but I know we want to kind of limit one Batman character there. So again, 99 to 2000 for that book. Next year, 2001 to 2002, Daredevil Yellow, the next book that we're doing, and then 2002, 2003, Spider-Man Blue. So
just pause for me for a second.
sure.
About how old do you think they were at that time? Like, we just listed like a 5 to 7 year mad sprint of prolific, incredible material. They're probably in their 40s.
Yeah, I think so. I think Tim Sale, I think he might have been his early 60s when he's passed away a couple years ago. So, yeah, at this point,
I'm just trying to think, because it seems like
late 30s, early 40s. I think Loeb's a little older than that. So yeah, these are guys that they're not 20 somethings. These guys aren't fresh, brand new, kind of just out of art school or whatnot. When they're pumping this stuff out, they're in their late 30s, early 40s, something like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, all I was going to say about their age is that I feel like, which maybe you would argue that this is wrong because of your love of like Tom King, but I feel like they wrote books that a young writer in their 20s could not have written. I think there's something about the way they handle a character that has a certain maturity to it. Like they honor everything that came before, but they also have a fresh vantage point. It's like a great summary of the character, but it's also not limited by everything that came before. Like I don't know how to. Am I getting close?
Yes, yes, and that's something I definitely want to talk about when we get into each individual one of these books here. That there is clearly so much knowledge of the character they have going into, because obviously they're especially in Spider-Man specifically, there are tons of homages and references to earlier stuff. That's the whole idea, is what that's based on, the early days of Spider-Man. You don't have to know that stuff as the reader. It's not necessary to know that, but it's clear that the people making it, the people putting this together, they have a reverence towards it, but they don't feel constricted by it. I do think there is a more mature approach to this, this understanding of like, we can do kind of what we want with these characters, but we know who they are. Nothing we're doing here is going to be contradictory or like character assassination or anything like that.
Right. But they know who they are, but they're not afraid to challenge the character and who the character is.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's what, like, in long continuity, that's what's sometimes lost, is like all the change is superficial.
Absolutely. And because these books are not, the stories they're telling are not in concurrent publishing time, like they're not part of the ongoing story, they're meant to be standalones. The events of these books happen. They are in the character's continuity. When is that continuity? Well, you can piece some things together here. Like again, Long Halloween is a story, it's a year one, year two story. Superman for All Seasons is a story about him. Like you see him in high school in Smallville and going off to just start being Superman in Metropolis. So it's early days of that. Both Yellow and Blue are the early days of Daredevil, early days of Spider-Man. So you can kind of sense about where we are in the story. If you wanted to go back chronologically to the actual issues, you can definitely do that. But yeah, they're putting their spin on it and their conceit on why things may not be exactly the way that they were in the comic is built into how they're telling their story, which again, we'll get into that as we talk about it. But you're right that there is a level of like adult supervision in these. There's something about them that feels like these are people who clearly know the history. But you're right, they're not afraid to tweak it and do their own thing.
The trick is, like, there are some people out there who are like, you read them and you're like, more often, no one named in particular, you watch adaptations of them and it's like, I don't think you know this character. Like, I don't think you read. I think you just like follow the lure and like, it's like you go to Comic-Con to learn about Batman rather
There's
than
an
sitting
idea
down
of the
and reading
character you
Batman.
have.
Yeah. And so I think some people get hung up in that, and then some, like a really mediocre writer. I'm not going to name a mediocre writer. I have a few that came to mind, which are like, they will do a serviceable job with the character. Like they understand the character, they've read all the character, and they will kind of toe the line for as long as they need to. Because there are some of those writers who could just plop down and do 50 to 100 issues. I mean, years and years of writing, Batman or whoever. And
they can move the character forward in terms of, here are the next stories, but they're not worried about changing fundamentally parts of the character.
And they don't step out of line, but they also don't do anything great.
Yeah.
And it's like, they're just kind of like, keep the universe going, keep the continuity going. And it's like, you need that, right? Because not every 12 issue series can be a catastrophic, turn everything on its head.
Yeah.
But those are the lightning rods for like us being drawn to books.
Yeah, of course. Well, yeah, and it's why these books stand out, because they are these self-contained miniseries, because they don't quote unquote affect the main line, that they're these standalone stories that you can jump into at any point if you just have some knowledge of the character. But what that requires is for the people making it to have that knowledge of the character too. They have to know how this is going to fit in to someone who both has read every issue of Amazing Spider-Man and the person that just has a passing knowledge, has just seen the movies. It has to work on both of those levels. And I think the four books that we chose here absolutely work. Daredevil, maybe people know Daredevil a little less, but I mean, Spider-Man, Batman, Superman. I mean, these are some of literally the most well-known and important characters in pop culture history. Um, so yeah, they have that, they bring that knowledge in there, but they present the story in a way where they know it's not required.
Yeah.
It's not required for to read there. So that was blue, right? It was in a 03. Yeah, okay. So a couple more left. So that was Spider-Man Blue 02 to 03, right? They go right into Hulk Gray, the third of their colors book at Marvel. That's 03 to 04. 04 to 05, back over to DC. They do Catwoman When in Rome, which is a concurrent story that happens at the exact same time as Dark Victory. So not even a sequel. It's kind of a side sequel there. That's to 05. Then in 04, they do one last story. It's called Solo. Well, issue number one. Solo was an initiative that DC threw out there to artists mainly, where they were given one issue to do a story about any character they wanted, and the artist had the option if they wanted to work with a writer or not. Like, it was an artist showcase. Tim Sale had issue number one, and I believe he worked with Loeb, Brian Azzarello, Darwin Cook, and Diana Schultz as writers there for his story. Darwin Cook eventually wrote and drew his own book for Solo. That was kind of the last really book they had done. That was in 04. We jump ahead to 2008, which is Captain America White, which is the last of their color series. A zero issue, kind of a preview, not an ashcan, like a preview issue. And it really was issue one, but it's labeled issue zero. That came out, I think, in Comic-Con in 2008. And then I think at that point, Loeb got so busy into his television work. Because in the early aughts at this point, he had worked on Smallville for a little while. He was a writer on Lost for a while. And eventually, I mentioned Heroes already. He was like a head writer for that for many years. And then in 2010, he was made the head of Marvel Television, and that did all of the television shows that were quote unquote set in the MCU, but not done by Marvel Studios. So that's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Agent Carter, Runaways, Cloak and Dagger, Inhumans, not so great, and all the Netflix shows, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Defenders, Punisher, all of that came under his supervision up until the point when Marvel Entertainment shuttered Marvel Television, and now it's all under Marvel Studios. And that's the TV shows that we've been getting now, the ones on Disney Plus, have all been under all Marvel Studios. But for a big chunk of time there, those all run by Jeph Loeb, which is why the next issue of Captain America White, issue one, didn't come out for 7 years. It came out in 2015 when it finally did hit shelves. And I think a lot of the art had been done on Loeb's part. It was just a matter of sorry, the art was done on Sale's part. It really what came down to was Loeb finding time to finish the scripts and write in the narration, because that's how most of these books are done. Heavy narration boxes. There are not a lot of scripts, not a lot of descriptions, not a lot of dialogue in how Loeb writes, and especially how he was writing these stories, especially the color stories. They were all what's the word, epistolary?
Yeah.
They're written kind of in letter form, which means it's all internal monologue for the characters. It's all narration boxes. And so those are things that he can discuss with Tim Sale. He can put the art down, and then it's a matter of him coming back and writing the scripts later. But
which, I've never, that's so obvious, but I've never clocked that's like, I just remember thinking, like, I would love to see a way for a Batman movie or like prestige TV show to do the internal monologue, and
it becomes like Blade Runner with the monologue. I mean, it's all voiceover. It's tough.
Well, but I think though, I mean, my pitch for like how to do it, which is not something we have time for, but is that if the beginning of each episode is him pulling into the Batcave at 4 a.m., 5 a.m., Alfred is helping stitch him up, and he's recapping the night for Alfred while like making an audio recording to like
For
do a brain
posterity.
dump, right?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
and then then you cut, and it's a different color scheme and things like
Mhm.
that to depict the things he's describing, but it has his reflections on it. It says what he's seeing, what he's processing, because it's like, uh, without that, like it's just a very different character. Like that's like it's like when you try to
Yeah.
film Sherlock Holmes. It's like if you
Yeah.
don't understand all the little gears and machinations and like the significance of seeing the cuff of someone's jacket or something like that,
Well,
then you're not really getting the character.
which is what made that BBC adaptation work so well because they did the things with the zooms and the camera work. So
Right.
the things that these are the things that he's noticing. Us, the audience, we don't know why they're important yet, but these are the things that he's noticing as a detective. And so there are some visual cues to way around that, but this is what it comes down to trying to adapt, explicitly adapt something that Loeb and Sale have done. And particularly the things that Loeb has written is that he loves his narration boxes. He loves that internal monologue. And again, I know there are plenty of readers that don't like that. They don't like reading that because sometimes it's just like a wall of text. And then some beautiful artwork that, you're seeing the action that's happening, but you're getting narration for something else that's going on in the character's head, that maybe he or she has been saying, that relates to something that happened years before, but you're watching it and there can be a disconnect there. So I understand why some people don't like that. I love it. Which is a huge reason why I love Tom King, because I do believe Tom King and the miniseries that he has been doing, both Marvel and DC, are the spiritual successor to the things that Loeb and Sale did. King loves the narration box. He loves stories that are told in that format, whether it's someone writing a letter to somebody or you're reading someone's journal, being told in that way. And a lot of his stories, I think King talks about how he always gets a question of like, well, your stories, are they in continuity? When does this happen? If Supergirl's on this planet right now, but she's doing this in the main, and his whole thing is like, yes, it all happened. The question is, when is it happening? And that's not really important. All it's important is that this adventure happened. I'm just telling it now. Doesn't matter what Supergirl's doing in the main universe right now. This adventure that she had with this one girl, Ruthie, here in his book, Woman of Tomorrow, that story happened. It doesn't matter when. This is just a story and an experience that this character had. And that same thought process, that same rationale is how you can look at all of the stories that we're having here. Like, when did these characters sit down and write these letters or make these recordings? It doesn't matter. It happened at one time. This is what the story is. You don't have to burden yourself with when in the story this is happening. Just know that it did
That
happen.
and like I'm just past the point of caring. I mean, there's like
Oh yeah,
my
yeah.
thing is like I'm so motivated by is it a good story or not? I'm not trying to build an encyclopedia of
Yeah.
these characters.
Well, yeah, but you have to acknowledge that those people exist, and there's
Oh
a
yeah.
large majority of people that exist that way.
Well, but
That,
yeah, and those people are not going to be appeased by what you just said or by any reason or logic.
oh yeah,
I
yeah.
think
Of
unless
course
it
they're
has
not.
like the legacy numbering in the corner and it's part of like the main series serialization, not
Yeah,
continuity, but serialized.
yeah, yeah.
It's
And
like that's crazy.
these,
And
yeah.
there are plenty of Batman stories that are like just very openly like, Sean Murphy's White Knight stuff is just like no,
Well,
it's
that's
not
an yeah,
continuity.
well,
It's just
that's an
like
Elseworld thing. Yeah, absolutely.
right.
But you could ask like, I mentioned Kevin Smith earlier. He has written
Oh yeah.
some Batman stuff that like Widening Gyre and Cacophony and things like that. Like those are just 3-issue, 4-issue miniseries. Just here's a story about the character. When it happens doesn't really matter. It's just here's one adventure. Here's one case.
Right.
And you don't have to burden yourself with, yeah, when does this happen? How does it happen? Where do the character? It doesn't matter. It's just one story, and that's what King does with so many of his miniseries. Like again, Strange Adventures, Mister Miracle. Maybe less so with something like The Vision. Vision just has to happen before certain other events happen. The I like his Penguin series is happening. At a certain time, but it again it's flashing back to earlier times. It doesn't matter when that is. And it's just the work that he does for his miniseries or his maxi series, whatever you want to call them, it has the spirit of the stuff that Loeb and Sale had been doing in the 90s and the early aughts. So again, it's no wonder why I gravitate towards both those kinds of works, because the stories that Loeb and Sale did were so fundamental for me getting back into superhero comics at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that and like, yeah, the whole continuity thing is just like, I've got such fatigue over it because I'm like, okay, so you go read a 50-year-old book from Batman where it's like, cell phones don't exist and whatnot. And you tell me that's in continuity with Batman who's using like high tech, like spiders climbing up buildings and things like that, and say, yeah, and he's still about the same age. His parents died. His parents died when he was that age, and it's
we're
like,
not, yeah,
right.
We're
It's
like,
not
getting into we're not going to talk about the sliding time scale here or ever. But yeah,
no.
just look
I'm
up
just.
look up
It's one of
sliding
those
time
things to
yeah.
say. It's just one of the things to say. Like, read for stories. And if someone like wanted to like get on a, I don't know, high hat or bent or something and say like, oh, Long Halloween isn't canon. I'm like, well, okay, but better than most of what you would call canon. So it's my canon.
Yeah, well, yeah, and also like it is canon. Although most of these books, I think these books they've replaced some canon. I think some parts of it have been replaced. Like I think, you know, the Two-Face origin, and I think is still the origin, but the, the question of what is canon, the answer is what's good, what people like. If it's no good, some creator will come and replace it later. If it's good and someone will pick up and a creator picks up on it 20 years later, then yeah, it was canon. That's what it is. That's a fluid argument, a fluid definition. But yeah, again, not things you need to concern yourself with if you haven't read Batman or Superman or Daredevil or Spider-Man. These are standalone stories, which again, which is why I contend that these are these are mainstream superhero big two comics that have indie comic sensibilities to them, whether they knew that or not at the time. The fact that these books exist and they're allowed to exist in the way they are with their peculiar structures and storytelling devices, things that you didn't see in the regular monthly issues, monthly floppies, that they allowed miniseries like these to exist with a style and a flair like this. Again, I think it gives them an independent comic feel, even though again you're talking about at least the three biggest characters in comic history. And again, I don't know where Daredevil falls. He's pretty popular, but like he's not as popular as Spider-Man, Batman, and Superman. So you're dealing with the biggest, most well-known characters ever, and you have the latitude to tell the kind of story that you want to tell in a way that really no one had done it previously, and really no one's done it since, unless it was Loeb and Sale doing it again.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, closest would be like a Tom King or someone, but
again, yeah, but I think that's the current day version of it now, when this idea is now set, when you can have a writer and an artist go off and do something in a completely different style, a completely different tone, and have that miniseries work. That's more accepted idea now, because there's a wider range of storytelling options and art options and everything options in the regular mainstream monthly space.
Right.
That latitude just wasn't there as much in the 90s when Loeb and Sale started this. Now it's much more regular. And yeah, I do think Tom King is the face of that. The work that he does with Mitch Gerads and Doc Shaner and Bill Kosevely and all of that, his freaking collaborators. They're allowed to do this now, I believe, because people like Loeb and Sale were allowed to do their work. They're the foundation. They walked so King and all them could run.
Yeah. Great. What's next?
God, I mean that's the end of the Loeb and Sale kind of their partnership. Again, it's about 12 books in what we'll call about 15 years, 12 different projects together. And I've read all of them. I mentioned I read all of them except two. I've never read The Challenge of the Unknown, and I've never read that Wolverine and Gambit book from 95.
Which you just said anything with mutants from the 90s.
Yeah, I don't know if we had that one. Again, 95, we're encroaching in on the era of in the main line. That was, we're getting into, Age of Apocalypse era, when for what, 4 months or whatever, the entire X office was flipped on its head. Still very, very strange. But yeah, I don't remember ever reading that one. Maybe I'll go back and check those out, just to be a completist, or completionist, I guess, whatever the word is. Go back and read Challenge of the Unknown from 91 and that Wolverine and Gambit series from 95. But other than that, I've read all the rest of them because,
Yeah, I have not done Captain America White.
yeah,
Like, I know that everything has its fan base, but I've not met
yeah.
one of those fans yet.
So yeah, I mean, so in terms of the Batman stories, again, we had Haunted Night, Long Halloween, Dark Victory, and again, I include Catwoman When in Rome because that's a concurrent story with Dark Victory. I think all those are bangers. Like, all those are like, those are 5.5 out of 5 in my book. Superman for All Seasons, I think, is a 5 out of 5. I'm spoiling this now. I think Daredevil Yellow is probably a 4.5. Spider-Man is like a 7 out of 5. Then I think Hulk Gray is like a 3.5 maybe, but I don't really like Hulk and I don't really care about Hulk. And then I think Captain America White is just, it's a struggle. It was a struggle to read when it came out. That might be like a 2 or something like that, 1.5, 2. It's a real struggle, and it is keeping with the motif of the colors and that whole theme. But I think there's something about, the length of time that sat on the shelf to come out. Maybe a different story if it came out in the same kind of back-to-back order that the rest of those books came out, where they were pumping books out again from both sides of the street. Couple of DC, couple of Marvel, couple of DC, couple of Marvel, just working constantly together and just putting out an incredibly high level of work. I think this being at the end, when Loeb as a writer has been doing so much other work, especially in television at that point, his focus was no longer on comics. And I think that's why that book suffers, not to throw aspersions on Loeb as a writer, but just as a writer at this time, because he wasn't focused just on comics. He was writing so much other stuff and really getting much deeper into television writing and show running and exec producing stuff, that I don't think the focus was there. And I think that's why, in my mind, Captain America White suffers. So
Yeah.
I do think it's a book that people should read, though, to kind of get the flavor of it. But again, all the Batman books, everything that revolves around Long Halloween, absolute bangers. Definitely got to read them.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say is, so the first book we're going to do is Batman Long Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
And just in case, anyone is thinking of doing the old English lit thing from high school and saying, like, I'm not going to read All Quiet on the Western Front, I'll just watch the movie. There, first of all, I'm pretty sure watching the 2-part animated Long Halloween adaptation would take longer than reading it.
It might. That's right.
It's probably about 3 hours, I think, for all of it.
I haven't watched that. I haven't watched many of the new ones in probably about 10 years. So,
but more importantly, in classic DC animated fashion, they change important things.
Yeah, of course they do. Yeah.
Including the ending, which is like, I was moderately enjoying myself for the animated version of like Gotham by Gaslight, and the change they made at the ending
That's
was
rough.
just
Yeah.
bananas.
Yeah, it's bad. Yeah.
The Hush change, where they literally got rid of the character Hush, that's another Loeb one.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm sorry,
some of the
who was
earlier
Hush
ones
now?
they did. What was that?
No,
What
I
was
was saying, that they cut the title character out of the
Oh
book
yeah,
Hush.
yeah.
It was like, it's just the Riddler.
The recent stuff hasn't been good, but I mentioned earlier the early runs of the early story arcs from Superman Batman that Loeb did with McGinnis and Michael Turner. That era of DC animation I think is awesome, and it's like Public Enemies. I think the Supergirl one is technically called Apocalypse because Darkseid is involved in that. But yeah, those are fantastic. You're right. The new ones have been a little iffy. But also again,
I still enjoy them. They're a good cast, they're good animation.
Yeah.
It's just
it's always great voice cast. You can definitely watch it for that. But as always, as we treat any of these books, like, we're not doing a recap of the story. We'll talk about the story, and specifically, Long Halloween is a mystery story. So we'll talk about the ways that mystery is deployed and given to the audience. We'll talk about those things as we always do. But yeah, you want to know. I was going to say what actually happened, as in, read the source, not watch the adaptation there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But But yeah, I mean, do you want to give a quick little? I know we've talked about Long Halloween a lot because that was both our entry points into these guys. But do you want to give a little quick rundown about all four of these books and kind of, we've touched on them all briefly here. But I mean, again,
Yeah, I
Long
mean,
Halloween, it's early days. I think the important thing about Long Halloween, I believe, and this is the thing, this is, if there's any main idea that I think Nolan took from this book, it's this. It's Long Halloween is a story about Batman's villains, his foes, transitioning from organized crime mob bosses to supervillains. Supervillains existed and they exist in Long Halloween, but this is the moment, this is the tipping point where it goes. This is the escalation scene. And the Batman Begins,
right.
right? Because Batman Begins is all about Scarecrow's there, but it's all about the mob. And when him and Gordon are on the rooftop, and he's like, "Listen, you start wearing body armor, they buy arm-piercing rounds. You start putting on a mask, and then the tease with the Joker card. That's the escalation, and that's what this story is about. It's that tipping point early in Batman's career. So you're not going to get some of there's no Robin here. Robin is introduced in Dark Victory. So it's early days of Batman where this mystery is set. And again, that tipping point between organized crime and supervillains, that's where we are with this story, which I think is why it makes it so evergreen, right? It's not tied to any version of of these characters that are out there. He's saying this is the beginning. This is where it started with these characters, and not just Batman, but all these villains. This is just past their origin points. He's met some of them. There's even a scene we'll talk about, like they go to Arkham, and he's even talking about like there's a lot more people here now, a lot more crazies here now, and Gordon is like, yeah, is that because you're here, or is this a natural progression? So that idea of that this is where Batman is at the time, and that's all you really need to know. That he has some experience with these characters, but he hasn't had the years-long battle with these supervillains that he will have going forward. He's still dealing with organized crime. He's still dealing with the mob. He's still dealing with dirty cops and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, that's really all you need to say about it. It's not hand-holdy and patronizing to do a page one. I don't think you have to see Bruce and Martha die.
No, no.
It's,
we should mention
always a refreshing to change in a Batman story.
Yes, we should mention that this is the longest of the books we're doing. This is 13 issues.
This is a big one. Yeah.
This is beefy. Yeah.
I haven't even said this to you offline yet, but I do have a fear that this will be a breathers situation where we'll do one discussion, but it'll be broken into 2 episodes. So stay tuned.
It's possible for this because it's a lot. And the storytelling format in this one is different than the other 3, and we'll definitely get to that in terms of how they settle into a storytelling mechanism. But Long Halloween is tremendous story, but it is you got to give yourself time to read it. It's a lot to get through versus something like our next book is Superman for All Seasons. That's only 4 issues, but those are 4 oversized issues, but still even 4 oversized issues is smaller than the 13 slightly oversized issues of Long Halloween. I already mentioned Superman for All Seasons is a story. It talks about essentially, Superman showing up in Metropolis for the first time, or it's early days. It starts off with him in Smallville, and in every issue he returns back to Smallville. And the conceit again for All Seasons is that each issue is themed around one of the seasons. It goes spring, summer, fall, winter, and each one of those books is narrated by a different person in Superman's life. So spring, when he's graduating high school and going off and thinking about what's next for his life, that's narrated by his father, Jonathan Kent. Summer, when he first shows up in Metropolis and working at the Daily Planet, and kind of what the early reaction is to who is this person, who is this hero. Summer is narrated by Lois Lane. Fall is narrated by Lex Luthor as Superman continues to be a presence in Metropolis, and what that means for someone like Lex Luthor and as his foe, enemy, rival, whatever it is. And then Winter is narrated by Lana Lang, who is Clark's high school friend, sweetheart, whatever you want to call it, which is Clark dealing with what it means to be both Clark Kent and Superman. So we get these stories about Clark, but they're being told to us, being relayed to us by the people in his life that he affects. And again, it's told in that either it's like a journal or a letter or an article or whatever it is. It's being relayed in a way to us, the reader, the way that these narrators are telling their story. And that sort of framework for storytelling is kind of what Loeb and Sale lean on kind of going forward. It starts here in For All Seasons.
Yeah. And then it's Daredevil next?
Yes,
No,
yeah, we go
okay,
Daredevil,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
Daredevil Yellow. We can actually talk about these kind of together because they're both very similar. Daredevil Yellow and Spider-Man Blue are explicit. Well, I guess they're not explicit letters. Daredevil, it's Matt Murdock is writing a letter to Karen Page. Karen Page, the first love of his life, who is dead in the comics, and had just died very recently in the comics run. So he is telling a story of his origin, his beginning stories when he was wearing the mostly yellow, kind of red um Daredevil suit. And again, he's writing this letter kind of as therapy, almost saying all the things to Karen that he wish he had said, looking back on his life and her life and how they intersected and how maybe if he had done things differently, she wouldn't have ended up what happened to her. That sort of thing. He's trying to work his way through his grief. Similarly, Spider-Man Blue is the same kind of way. Spider-Man Blue is set at a time when he is now often married with Mary Jane, but it is Valentine's Day of some unknown year. Spider-Man is feeling sad. He's feeling blue. He kind of works his way through the attic. He finds some stuff that reminds him of Gwen or whatnot. He finds a tape recorder, and the 6 issues here are him dictating a message back to Gwen. And again, it recounts the early days of him as Spider-Man, his earliest battles against some of his greatest foes, and how that intersected with his life, Mary Jane, Flash Thompson, Harry Osborn, all of that group of people together. And very similarly to Matt Murdock here, although for Matt, Karen's death is a very recent thing, in terms of the character we're seeing that Loeb and Sale are working with Peter Parker in Spider-Man Blue. Gwen's death is several years on, but he's still coming to terms with this, and still kind of working his way through, maybe not through his grief or guilt, but just trying to process that and move forward with it. And so they're told again in these long narration boxes of here's what I'm thinking now, and boy, what I wish I knew then when these things were happening. And so that's the setup for both those books. Really, the 3 of them there, if you include Superman, looking back on the early days of them as their heroes and seeing how either the people around them look at them or how the characters now view what their actions did and how they affected those people around them, and specifically the people they loved.
Yeah. Which, to go back to your Tom King comp, that Tom King is never telling a story at the beginning of someone's career.
Exactly.
It's always trying to move forward, but at a moment where they have to reflect on what's come before.
Exactly.
And,
His setup is a little different, but the presentation is very much the same in terms of it's all
it feels
internal
like
model.
a good influence. He's not a copycat. Of Loeb, in any way, but I had like very mixed reviews when I read Spider-Man Blue. So I think that's going to be a really interesting one. I'm quite certain I'm wrong. Like it was so hyped for me and I didn't really enjoy it. But I know I need to read it again at least once and chew on it and probably talk through it with a big Spider-Man fan.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if I'm a big Spider-Man fan, but it is my favorite Spider-Man story of all time. Like it is my number 1 Spider-Man story. So
okay, yeah, and which I don't even know if I've read another whole Spider-Man story to compare it to. Like I love Spider-Man in movies and stuff, and I'm enjoying Ultimate Spider-Man, but that's not really Spider-Man. So it's like, like I might not be a huge like comic Spider-Man fan, which I think I could live with that if that's the case. Um, but yeah, there were like storytelling choices there that I can't tell if they were like cultural blinders or really intentional writing from the perspective of a young, like, adolescent male. Um,
Okay. All right.
so,
Well,
well,
we'll get to that. That's it.
we'll get to that,
That's good setup for
especially to
discussion
compare and
four. Yeah.
contrast to like, well, do they do the exact same thing with Daredevil? Do they do the
Hmm.
exact same thing with Superman? Because it's like if they're a one trick bag, that's one thing. So, yeah, like, and I think there is some of the like, I think a lot of TV shows, movies, like we're in the era of like just 4 billion comic adaptations. And I think the painful trope now is like uh the male superhero feeling super responsible about the woman in his life and not giving
Yeah.
her respect and agency, and then he has to learn to do that and deal with the consequences and yada yada. Like that feels so played out now, but I don't think it did when Loeb and Sale were doing this. Perhaps that's a
Well,
perennial, like, age old comic thing.
yeah, and I think there is definitely a conversation about characters getting fridged. Thank you, Gail Simone. But what's the key thing here is that Loeb and Sale didn't kill those characters.
Well, that's the other
Yeah,
complaint I've heard about Spider-Man Blue is that,
yeah,
which, like, this one, even as someone who didn't enjoy it as much as I probably should have, I was reading other people's reviews of it on Goodreads, always a mistake. And like some people were saying uh like they didn't even try to tell a new Spider-Man story, they just retold old ones. And I was like, right, he reflected on old ones. Like they
yeah,
weren't retelling old stories. It was a purposeful, deliberate, interpretive reflection
yeah,
that was like emotionally cathartic and
yeah,
therapeutic.
and
That's very
to
different than saying like, well, they're just like cover bands. They just redid this, and
yeah, no, yeah, you're right. It is Peter looking back on those. They are recreating those moments from specific issues, and you can even find the exact issues of Amazing Spider-Man where they're pulling these things from for his encounters with his, like, Rhino, Vulture, Craven, Green Goblin, all that stuff. You can find the exact issues that they are referencing from Peter Parker's his own fictional history timeline. They're pulling from specific issues. And yeah, but it's all about him looking back on it and trying to put it in context of where he is now and what ended up happening to not just Gwen, specifically Gwen, but all of him, all of their friends, that whole group of them. And Daredevil is a similar way. They're going back to the beginning and saying, here are the early stories, and here's what I know now that I wish I could have done differently then. And it's about putting new context on what those stories are, what those stories were. Because again, they didn't kill these characters, and the larger question of killing off female characters for the development of a male character is a whole other kettle of fish. So they're not trying to address that. They're simply saying we're working in this space and this is what exists.
right.
And so this is our entry point in to tell this story as a way of examining who the character is now. Yeah, probably better if they didn't just kill off female characters like this, but it's a long time ago. So I guess
Oh yeah.
Karen Page didn't die that long ago, but still, that idea of how those characters were often treated, it is tropey, and it
Oh
very
no,
much
I
was
actually have
so,
a
and it
problem with
still
the way
is.
they're written when they're alive.
Well,
It's
that
like, I
well,
mean,
well,
that's
that's often what happens when a character then gets quote unquote fridged, is that they have no characterization other than to die. So I don't believe that exists for someone like Karen Page and or Gwen Stacy, because we
right.
saw those characters.
And this
They
exists in the world where they have dozens
yeah,
or hundreds of issues of
yeah, yeah,
history,
yeah, 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 yeah. So, but
especially
again,
Karen Page. It's like,
yeah,
because then
she's
you
around.
got women writers on Daredevil,
Yes, yeah,
or at least one,
yeah. You
and
you you have
Nocenti.
you have Nascenti. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we're not going to be discussing that when we talk about these books, but I think we should say we're going to talk about them in the order of their publication. So when we talk about Long Halloween, we're going to try to talk about that in some isolation. And then when we talk about for all seasons, we're going to look at those two and see how they influence each other. But we're going to try and not reference the books that came after to show what they, how
The
those books been
progression. Yeah, we'll
influenced.
cover the progression the way they did.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to assume that we're covering these as if we were reading them as they're being published. So when you read Long Halloween, that's the only one of the four books that you would have access to. So we're going to try to do that so to help progress our conversation in terms of compare, contrast, look at similar ideas or dissimilar ideas or whatever it is, which I think helps the Long Halloween conversation, because that's going to be a lot to get to on its own, as we mentioned. That's the heaviest tome to get through.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm like, even the one, like it may have sounded like I'm not excited to read Superman Blue. I'm very excited to read it, and I'm hoping that I come away with a better perspective on it and that I can appreciate it more, especially since, like, I've never read Loeb and Sale covering different characters within the same year of each other. Like, all my reading for them has been so spaced out. To do the comparative reading is a whole other experience.
And have you read For All Seasons?
No, I think I have it on my shelf, and I like, when I picked it, I was like, what if we do these 4 books? And I started flipping through it over the weekend, and I was like, I don't think I've read this. I'm like, this is like, the cover is super familiar, but I don't think I've actually read it. So
that'll be fun to see. Yeah, that'll be fun.
That's going to be a breath of fresh air after the 13 slightly oversized issues of Long Halloween.
Yeah. So that'll be good. That'll be fun to get to. I can't wait.
Oh, and I guess the one other caveat we should throw out here in the Creator Spotlight is that we always talk about how we only cover closed canon, finite things, and that this is coming out in August 2024, and in September 2024, there is a new Long Halloween title. However, I consider all of that stuff to be its own miniseries or something.
And this is what I'll say. It's called The Last Halloween. It's not a sequel to Long Halloween. It's a sequel to Dark Victory, with Dark Victory in and of itself already a sequel. So we've already.
And then after that will be Darkest Victory.
Yeah. So there is an ongoing story. They're revisiting it. Loeb is revisiting it with there was a first issue that was done. It was Long Halloween special that was drawn by Tim Sale, which I believe was one of his last things he did before he passed. This new miniseries is going to be done by Eduardo Risso, who has elements of his style that are similar to Tim Sale. But yeah, it is a sequel. But again, Dark Victory already exists as a sequel. But yeah, they are discrete stories, and so you get to the end of Long Halloween, and it's a complete story. And you don't wonder, gee, I wonder what happens next. What happens next is Batman,
right?
Like what happens next is all the canon, all the stories of Batman. This is just one story in there. So yes, there are sequels out there. There's going to be more sequels out there. But we're not going to concern ourselves with that. That's a good point. That's a good caveat to bring up.
Yeah. I was just thinking that because I was like, surely someone will ask me at some point, pretty sure they're still working on that. Yeah, it's like,
yes,
well,
they are.
And it's like, if we ever had like a spot, gap in the future, now that we've done like our Loeb Sale intro, and we will have done those 4, I'd be fine picking up, Dark Victory
and Catwoman together or something like that.
Something like just
and
drop
then
another 1 or 2.
Maybe we do gray and white. And talk about what works and doesn't work in those books. Who knows? But yeah, that could be down the line. I want to
find a Hulk fan, but I don't know if they exist. No,
they do. Hulk is.
I know they exist. I don't know if Hulk is anyone's favorite. Like I know people.
No, I
very much like Hulk.
I knew a guy growing up. He was the guy that got my brother into comics, and I think is the person that took him to the comic shop the first time. Huge Hulk fan. Like that was Hulk was his character. So
I respect.
Don't know if he still is.
Ed
Maybe
Norton,
still is. But yeah,
Ed Norton was a very, very big Hulk fan. He had a very particular vision for his movie based on his comic reading.
And Gray was an influence on that, much like Nolan used the Batman books for his movies. They were using Gray as kind of an overview inspiration for that Incredible Hulk movie, which again, Edward Norton may not be in the MCU anymore, but that Hulk character still is. That is the Ruffalo Hulk character. So
Right.
they use that as a foundational inspiration piece for the MCU Hulk, which is the one that everyone knows now. So,
but Betty got sent to Mandyland, which is
yeah.
crossing
Well, no, she's
canons of
coming back though. Coming back. She's in Brave New World, or whatever. Yeah, the new Captain
Did they
America.
recast her?
No, Liv Tyler's coming back.
Oh my gosh, I missed that in the trailer. So
well,
now
no,
you know. Now you know when we're
we're recording
this.
it. Yeah,
we're recording right after the trailer.
She's not in the trailer, but they're bringing her back. The Tim Blake Nelson character, the leader, he's coming back. We've already seen Emil Blonsky back. So yeah, they're working their way into, hey, remember Incredible Hulk? You don't. Not a problem. Forget about it. We're just what you need to know. We're selling you right now. But yeah. So again, another way to show that these books are in a way foundation, that this is who these characters when they've captured an essence about the beginning of these characters early on, what their early struggles were, what their mindset was, how they were dealing with trying to do the things they were doing before they got good at doing them. That's the strength of these Loeb and Sale books. You see it a little bit in Batman and Long Halloween. He's a little more established there, but you definitely see it in the following 3 books we're going to cover. And For All Seasons, in Yellow and White, Yellow and Blue, you see these characters, these heroes at their earliest moments, and you see how they work through those initial for doubts and lack of order, lack of a better word. The idea of can I do this? What am I doing? Should I be doing this? All those things.
Yeah, I mean,
explore those and explore them well.
They get into the human side of the character so much, so that then when something pops up and they have to go back into hero mode, all the vulnerability and insecurity that they're carrying with them into that. Yeah. And it's like, if the story had just opened with them swinging into action, it's a totally different scene.
Yeah. It's a totally different book. Yeah. It reads completely differently. And that's where, as much as I think Long Halloween is a masterpiece, and it is, when you start getting that introspective look, when you start getting the narration about the character, and that becomes the focus, not so much what's actually happening in the book, like what's happening panel to panel. There's gorgeous, incredible art. That story is less important than what you're learning about the characters, whether it's in For All Seasons, where you have these 4 people in Superman's life talking about him and observing him and commenting on him, or in Yellow and Blue, when the character themselves are being introspective and reflecting on themselves. That's where I think the partnership of Loeb and Sale really, really sings. And it makes Long Halloween a bit of an outsider, and those Batman books are a bit of an outside. Even though it was early, that becomes the exception because they fall into a rhythm and a storytelling style afterwards. But again, I still think Long Halloween is a masterpiece as a story in terms of story delivery and storytelling. It is a slightly different pitch than what they start throwing later.
Yeah. All right. Well, without any further ado, I think our longest zero ever, which we knew it was going to be.
It was going to be a long one. Yeah.
Next week is either going to be a 2-parter or our longest single episode ever.
Yeah.
On the long.
We'll see how that goes. Yeah. See how it goes.
So anyway, we'll play it by ear, but be sure to check the name of that episode. I think even if it is a 2-parter, you will have need to read all 13 issues before listening to part 1, because they're not going to be divided like issues or 1 through 6 and 7 through 13. So so read it all. If you got to sit on it for a couple of weeks, totally understand. But it's also a readily available book. It is out in multiple printings of paperback. You can still track down single issues if you are the completionist. Mm-hmm. Hoopla, Libby, digital apps everywhere. Comixology has it. Like if you go into a comic book shop and ask for Long Halloween, and they don't say, oh, well, we just sold our last one, there's more on the way, or they can point you to it, then it's not a real comic shop. That's clearly a drug front. Like there's like any self-respecting comic shop will have this in stock. Usually Barnes and Noble, like I mean, like
any bookstore.
every bookstore that has the ability to sell it sells this book.
Yep.
So anyway, get your hands on it. It also makes a great gift. So even if you want to read it once and give it away, it's a great Kickstarter for getting people to comics, especially if they enjoy Batman movies. So with all that, we will see you 13 issues from now, or 1 week, however you want to count it. And until then, thanks for listening, and can't wait to talk about Jeph Loeb and Sale.
Peace.